I, the one telling you this story, am Ethan Riley, an architecture student who had just gone through a period of academic pressure and wanted to find a quiet place to relax. This terrifying story happened in the summer of 2024, when my girlfriend, Sophia Chen, and I decided to rent an old vacation house in the suburbs of New Orleans, Louisiana. The house looked ordinary, a little dilapidated, with dark red brick walls and rusted wrought iron balconies. It was hidden deep in a small alley, surrounded by old oak trees draped with Spanish moss, and a desolate garden. The house we rented looked quite simple, but it had an antique, gloomy appearance, as if it had witnessed centuries of ups and downs. Dark red brick walls, layers of moss clinging to the tiled roof, and large, dust-covered windows created a mysterious picture. When we arrived, the humid New Orleans air hit us, carrying the scent of wild jasmine and decaying earth. The weak afternoon sunlight filtered through the old oak trees, casting strange long shadows on the damp ground. Everything seemed peaceful and quiet, but I felt a vague sense of unease. The house had a musty and old wood smell lingering in the air, especially on the ground floor and the long hallway leading to the back. On the first night, after a quick tidy up and unpacking, Sophia and I chatted on the large bed, listening to crickets chirping in the garden, and the wind rustling through the oak leaves. We tried to reassure ourselves that these were just normal sounds of an old house in the suburbs. However, I felt a sudden bone-chilling cold rush into the room, intensely cold, making me shiver. Sophia also shivered slightly, looking at me with worried eyes. We looked around the room, saw nothing, only the faint streetlights shining through the window. The first few days in the new house passed relatively peacefully. We spent time exploring the ancient city of New Orleans and its vibrant neighborhoods. However, strange signs began to appear, very subtly and difficult to explain at first. Frequently, as night fell, Sophia and I heard very faint noises coming from the living room, right below our bedroom. Clanking sounds, rustling sounds, as if someone was moving something, or very faint footsteps. We tried to reassure ourselves, assuming it was small animals or due to the old house's system. But the feeling of being watched became increasingly clear. We often felt as if someone was standing right behind us, even when we were in the kitchen or living room. The temperature in the room also changed suddenly, with intensely cold spots, even during the day. The climax occurred one afternoon, as we were sitting reading in the living room. Suddenly, a small picture frame placed on the fireplace naturally moved gently, about a few centimeters. We flinched, staring at the picture frame, our hearts pounding in our chests. We were sure we hadn't touched it. We tried to reassure ourselves, assuming it was just because the floor was uneven, or we had missing it. But immediately after that, we felt a sudden bone-chilling cold rush over us, intensely cold, and a shiver ran down our spines, as if someone was standing right behind us. We shivered, trying to turn our heads, but dared not. We knew something was right behind us. It was breathing, it was waiting. We stood motionless for a few seconds, then quickly got up, left the living room, turned on all the lights in the house. Fear had begun to creep into our minds. Our fear grew increasingly intense. Every 1 or 2 nights, the strange noises from the living room and the feeling of being watched reappeared. This time, the noises were not merely clanking sounds, but also mixed with moans, scratching sounds against the walls, and sometimes, very faint whispers, their content unclear, as if someone was calling our names. We couldn't get any good sleep anymore. During the day, we always felt tired and sluggish, our minds not clear. One evening, as Sophia was standing in front of the mirror in the bathroom, brushing her hair, suddenly, she saw a blurry figure flit by behind her in the mirror. It was very fast, blurry, and fleeting, but Sophia was certain she saw it. The figure looked like a woman with long hair, but it had no clear shape, just a blurry mass faintly glowing. When she turned to look closely, she saw nothing, only the empty wall behind her. Sophia shivered, trying to dismiss the thought, but the feeling of being watched kept engulfing her, even when she was in her own house. She felt as if hundreds of eyes were staring at her from deep in the darkness. The climax occurred one late night, around 3 a.m. Sophia was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when she suddenly heard a very faint whisper. "Sophia." The voice was cold, faint, but utterly haunting, echoing right next to her ear. Her heart pounded in her chest. She bolted upright in bed, trembling uncontrollably. She looked around the room, saw nothing. Only darkness enveloped her and the wind whistled outside the window. The calling of her name only lasted a few seconds, then died down, leaving a terrifying silence surrounding her. Sophia couldn't fall back asleep anymore. She lay awake in bed, listening to every slightest sound. Every gust of wind whistling through the door crack made her jump. The feeling of being haunted kept engulfing her. Sleepless nights and eerie cries from the living room had begun to seriously affect Sophia's mental state. She frequently had strange, recurring dreams. In her dreams, she always found herself alone in the living room, and a woman in an old white wedding dress, with a pale face, long black disheveled hair partially obscuring her face. But her hollow eyes stood out clearly, full of pain and hatred, staring at her. The woman said nothing, only extended her hand towards her, as if begging for help, or wanting to drag her into eternal darkness. Sophia always woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding wildly. One morning, as Ethan and Sophia were searching for an old book in the house's small library, suddenly, Sophia noticed an old wooden box hidden in the corner of the bookshelf, covered in dust. She opened the box. Inside were a few old items, a rusted silver comb, and a yellowed black and white photo. The photo showed a young woman with a sad face, wearing a wedding dress, standing in front of this very house. But there was something very strange about it. Her eyes looked directly at us, as if she knew we would find this photo. Sophia suddenly heard a very faint whisper. "He left me." The voice was cold, faint, but clearer than ever before, echoing right next to her ear. She flinched. Looking around the room, saw nothing. Only the wind whistling outside the window and the distant sound of cars passing by on the street. Sophia felt a sudden bone-chilling cold rush over her. Intensely cold, and a shiver ran down her spine, as if someone was standing right behind her. She shivered, trying to turn her head, but dared not. She knew something was right behind her. It was breathing, it was waiting. She stood motionless for a few seconds, then quickly ran out of the living room, turned on all the lights in the house, and didn't dare turn them off until the next morning. Fear had completely consumed her. We couldn't endure it anymore. We decided we would find out the truth about the strange phenomena that were occurring and about the woman in the photo. We started looking for information about the history of the house and the people who had lived there, as well as local folklore or mysterious incidents that had occurred in this New Orleans suburb. After many days of searching and interviewing elderly local residents, we found some old newspaper articles on local news websites and some archival documents from the city library. These documents told of a tragic suicide that occurred in the 1950s. Right in this house, a young woman named Genevieve Dubois committed suicide right in the living room, after being abandoned by her fiancé just before their wedding. It was said that she died in extreme agony and despair, and her spirit was still trapped in the house. She couldn't find peace because of her suffering. Subsequent tenants or buyers of this house were unable to live there for more than a few months due to the continuous strange phenomena. We read those lines, feeling a chill run down our spines. We understood that The white shadow and the faint whispers were the spirit of Genevieve Dubois. She was seeking release, or comfort. After learning Genevieve Dubois' tragic story, we felt a deep sense of pity for her. We knew she was suffering, and we had to do something to help her find peace. We decided to perform a small ritual to help Genevieve find peace. One rainy night, when everything was silent, and the rain pattered outside the window, we went to the living room, where Genevieve Dubois had committed suicide. The air was bone-chilling cold and still, only the sound of rain and the wind whistling through the window cracks. We lit a candle, placed a bouquet of white lilies and a letter of apology on behalf of her abandoned fiancé on the floor, and I began to read the prayers I had found in an old book about spiritual rituals, wishing Genevieve peace and release. As I read to the end of the prayer, I suddenly felt a bone-chilling coldness envelop me and Sophia, stronger than ever before. The hairs on our bodies stood on end. Then, from the air, a faint whimpering sound echoed, but it was no longer as painful as before, but mixed with a hint of relief and gratitude. We saw no figure, but we felt a very close presence, a faint energy, gradually fading into the air. I felt as if someone gently touched our shoulders, then slowly withdrew. We stood there for a long time, feeling the change in the air. The smell of must and coldness were still there, but the unpleasant foul odor had disappeared, and the heavy feeling was no longer as intense as before. We believed that Genevieve Dubois had heard us, and she had found some peace. The next morning, we felt exhausted, but also a little relieved. Since that night, we no longer heard strange noises from the living room, and Sophia's terrifying dreams also stopped appearing. We still often felt cold when entering the dark areas of the house, but no longer the extreme fear we had before. Sometimes, we still felt a fleeting chill, or heard a very faint sigh, but we believed it was just the lingering echo of what had happened. We still lived in that house for the rest of our summer vacation, but we became more cautious, and never dared to be alone on rainy nights anymore. We also started taking more interest in supernatural stories, and believed that there are things that science cannot explain. The old house in the New Orleans suburbs, where we once sought a quiet place to relax, has now become a part of our lives, a part of a true scary horror story that we witnessed. Did Genevieve Dubois' spirit truly find peace? Or is she still there, in the old house, waiting for other weak and vulnerable victims? We don't know, and we don't dare find out more. I, the one telling you this story, am Olivia Carter, a single woman prone to excessive worrying who had just moved to a small town in Pennsylvania to start a new job. It happened in the winter of 2022. When I rented an old apartment on the second floor of a centuries-old building in the town center. The building looked ordinary, a bit run down, with dull brick walls and faded wooden window frames. It was located on a quiet cobblestone street, surrounded by quaint shops and small cafes. The apartment I rented looked quite cozy, but it had an eerily quiet atmosphere, as if it had witnessed many joys and sorrows of those who had lived here. The pale painted walls had begun to peel. The old wooden floorboards creaked every time I walked, and the small windows overlooking the deserted street created a somewhat isolated space. When I arrived, the cold winter air seeped through every crack, carrying the scent of must and old wood. The faint light from the old ceiling lamp cast down, creating shadowy areas in the apartment. Everything seemed peaceful, but I felt a vague unease, as if something was wrong. The apartment had a peculiar scent lingering, like dried lavender mixed with a bit of dust, especially in the bedroom and kitchen. On the first night, after arranging my belongings and trying to get used to the new space, I lay awake on the single bed, listening to the wind whistling through the window cracks and the footsteps echoing from the floor below, seemingly belonging to the elderly landlord. I tried to reassure myself that these were just normal sounds of an old building. However, I felt a sudden bone-chilling cold rush into the room, so cold that I had to pull the blanket over my head. I looked around the room, saw nothing, only the faint streetlight shining through the thin curtains, casting strange swaying shadows on the walls. The first few days in the new apartment passed quite slowly. I tried to focus on my remote work and get acquainted with this quiet small town. However, strange signs began to appear, very subtle and difficult to explain, making me start to doubt my own senses. Frequently, when I was alone in the apartment, I heard very faint noises coming from the next room, the one I decided to use as my office. A soft clicking sound, like someone lightly typing on a keyboard, or the rustling of paper. I checked the office, but saw nothing unusual. All the belongings were still in place. Then I began to notice small objects in the apartment seemingly shifting positions randomly. The coffee cup I left on the kitchen counter this morning, I would find on the bookshelf in the afternoon, or the TV remote I remembered leaving on the sofa, would be lying on the floor. I told myself that perhaps I was forgetful, but these things happened more and more often. The climax occurred one evening, when I was sitting working late in the living room. I suddenly felt like someone was standing right behind me. A cold sensation spread throughout my body, and I felt an invisible presence, very close. I cautiously turned my head, but saw no one, only the still shadows behind the armchair I was sitting in. However, the feeling of being watched did not disappear. I felt like an invisible pair of eyes was following my every move in the apartment. The temperature in the room also changed erratically. There were times when I felt intensely cold in one corner of the room, even though the heater was working normally. My anxiety grew. The small noises and the feeling of being watched constantly haunted me, making it difficult for me to focus on work or relax. I began to have trouble sleeping at night, often tossing and turning and waking up in the middle of the night for no clear reason. One late night, as I was trying to fall asleep, I suddenly heard a very faint sigh, but full of sadness, echoing right beside my bed. My heart pounded in my chest. I turned on the bedside lamp and looked around the room, but saw no one. The room was still silent, only the gentle wind blowing through the window cracks. I tried to reassure myself that it was just the wind, or that I was too stressed and misheard. But that sigh kept repeating in my mind, carrying a melancholic sadness. After that night, I began to have strange, recurring dreams. In my dreams, I always saw myself standing in a dark room, and at the far end of the room, a blurry figure of a woman was standing silently, her back to me. I couldn't see her face clearly, but I felt an extreme sadness and loneliness radiating from that figure. Sometimes, the figure would slowly turn around, and although her face was still hidden in the darkness, I would feel a tremendous resentment and pain directed towards me. I always woke up with my heart racing and an indescribable feeling of fear. These dreams made me even more anxious and sleepless. The tension within me escalated. The strange events were no longer just vague signs, but began to become clearer and more terrifying. I began to doubt my own sanity, whether it was all just my anxiety and imagination. One morning, as I was putting on makeup in front of the bathroom mirror, I suddenly saw a shadow flit behind me in the mirror. It was very fast, blurry, and only flashed in the corner of my eye, but I was sure I saw it. The shadow seemed to be a woman with long black hair, but it had no clear shape, just a blurry dark streak that flashed quickly. When I quickly turned around, I saw nothing, only the wall behind me. I shivered, trying to reassure myself that it was just a hallucination because I was still sleepy. But one late night, when I was lying reading in bed, suddenly, I heard a very faint whisper, cold and chilling, echoing right next to my ear. The voice was a woman's voice, but very small, like a cold breath on my ear, and I couldn't understand clearly what she was saying. only felt a deep sorrow and resentment in that voice. I flinched, my heart pounding. I quickly sat up and looked around the room, but saw no one. The room was still pitch black. Only the faint streetlight shone in. I tried to listen, but heard no more whispers, only the terrifying silence that enveloped the apartment. I couldn't fall back asleep anymore. Fear surrounded me, making me feel like a cold hand was squeezing my heart. The haunting became increasingly severe, making my life extremely difficult. I often felt tired, anxious, and scared. I decided I had to learn about the history of this apartment, whether anyone had experienced similar things to me before. I started searching online for information about the building and the area. I found a few posts on local forums talking about strange rumors surrounding the building. Some people said that there had been a suicide in one of the apartments on the second floor many years ago. A young woman named Eleanor Vance had thrown herself from the apartment window after being abandoned by her lover. The posts described Eleanor as a gentle and artistic soul, but very fragile and vulnerable. Her death had caused a great shock to this small town, and it was said that her spirit still lingered here, unable to move on because of her pain and torment. As I read these lines, I felt a terrifying coincidence with what I was experiencing. The blurry figure I saw, the sad sighs I heard, and even the cold whispers calling my name, all seemed to be related to Eleanor Vance. Perhaps her spirit was trapped in this apartment, and for some reason, she was trying to contact me. I felt a deep sympathy for Eleanor, but at the same time, fear overwhelmed me. Could a tormented and resentful spirit harm me? In the following days, the strange phenomena continued to occur, but with greater frequency and scarier intensity. I not only heard noises and felt the presence anymore, but also began to see clearer signs of the haunting. One evening, as I was sitting watching TV in the living room, suddenly, the table lamp beside me flickered continuously, even though I was sure it was working normally. I got up to check, but as soon as I touched the switch, the light went out completely. The room plunged into darkness, and at that moment, I felt a cold hand gently touch my shoulder. I screamed in terror and quickly backed away, turning on my phone's flashlight, but saw no one. However, on the table in front of me, the glass of water I had just poured had tilted over, water spilling out, as if someone had just touched it. The climax occurred one late night, as I was lying in bed, trying to sleep. Suddenly, I felt someone sit down on the edge of the bed beside me. The bed visibly sank, and I felt a cold breath on me. Trembling, I opened my eyes, and in the faint moonlight shining through the window, I clearly saw the figure of a woman sitting there, her back to me. She was wearing a long white dress, and her long black hair fell down, obscuring her face, but I felt the extreme pain and loneliness radiating from her. I tried to speak, but my throat constricted, unable to utter a word. Then, the woman slowly turned her head, and although her face was still shrouded in darkness, I could still feel her hollow eyes staring at me, carrying a sadness and resentment that words cannot describe. I screamed silently and tried to struggle, but my body was paralyzed, unable to move. In the extreme panic, I finally managed to break free and bolted out of bed, rushing out of the bedroom, running frantically down the stairs. I didn't dare look back, only heard light footsteps chasing behind, and the cold feeling still clung to me. I ran out of the apartment, down the street into the cold night, ignoring the curious glances of a few passers-by. I ran and ran, until I had no strength left, then collapsed on the sidewalk, gasping for breath. The next morning, I woke up in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, still trembling and completely mentally exhausted. I dared not go back to that apartment. I contacted the landlord, saying that I couldn't continue renting and quickly packed the few belongings I had left. Then left that small town immediately. I never wanted to go back there again. Even now, I can't forget what happened in that old apartment. The image of the woman in the white dress with hollow eyes still haunts my dreams. And I always feel a vague fear whenever I'm alone in the dark. I don't know if Eleanor Vance has found peace, or if her tormented spirit still lingers there, waiting for the next victims. This story remains a true scary horror story, with no resolution, and it will forever be a terrifying memory in my life. It was the autumn of 2018, when Clara, a young landscape architect, moved into a small house in the suburbs of Salem, Massachusetts, to escape the overwhelming pressure of her job, and a private loss she never spoke of. The house, an old two-story wooden villa, looked ordinary, even a bit dreary with its peeling paint and decaying fence. It was hidden behind ancient maple trees, creating a strange, secluded atmosphere, completely separate from the neighboring houses. When Clara opened the heavy oak door, a musty smell, mixed with a hint of old, rotting wood, assailed her nostrils, making her shiver slightly. The weak afternoon sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, just enough to illuminate the dust motes dancing in the air, creating a gloomy, eerily silent scene. She dragged her suitcase inside, the wheels screeching on the wooden floor, breaking the terrifying silence of the house. Clara was an introverted person, prone to excessive worry, especially after recent stressful events in her life. This house, despite its age, somehow gave her a strange sense of security, a place where she could hide from the outside world. She put her belongings down, trying to shake off the creeping sensation that clung to her. But there was something, an invisible feeling, that kept clinging to her, as if someone was standing right behind her, watching her every move. The first few days passed quite peacefully, with only the wind whistling through the cracks in the door, the dry branches scraping against the roof, and the rattling of old pipes. Clara spent her time cleaning, rearranging furniture, trying to make the old house feel more cozy. But then, strange things began to appear, very small, very subtle, but enough to catch her attention. Occasionally, when she was reading in the living room, she would hear faint whispers, like someone talking in another room. But when she went to check, everything was silent. Once, she left her keys on the kitchen counter, but when she returned, they were neatly placed on the windowsill. Clara told herself it was just her absent-mindedness, or that the house was too old, causing strange sounds. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger within her, especially when night fell. An unusual chill often enveloped the house. Sometimes she felt the temperature drop suddenly at certain points, as if an invisible cold draft was passing through. Strange dreams also began to haunt her, repeating vague images of a woman with long hair, her face obscured, standing silently in the corner of the room, staring at her. She woke up, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding, and it took a long time for her to fall back asleep. The initial signs gradually became clearer and more terrifying. Clara began to frequently see dark shadows flitting past the corner of her eye, especially when she walked down the dark hallway, or when she was alone in the living room. She would spin around, but there was nothing, just the deafening silence and the old walls. Once, she was peeling fruit in the kitchen, when she suddenly heard a very clear whisper, as if someone was calling her name. Clara, she dropped the knife, her heart pounding like a drum. She looked around. There was no one, only the wind whistling through the slightly open window. Objects in the house also began to move inexplicably. A vase placed on the dining table suddenly shattered to the floor, without any reason. She stood frozen, looking at the broken glass, and felt a chill run down her spine. Clara began to sleep very little. The terrifying dreams continued to torment her, becoming clearer and clearer. She clearly saw the face of the woman in her dreams, black, lifeless eyes, and a grotesque, distorted smile. She began to doubt herself, whether she was simply too stressed, or if the house was truly haunted. The tension reached its peak when Clara began to see even more terrifying things. One evening, as she stood in front of the bathroom mirror, she suddenly saw a reflection behind her. It was the woman from her dreams, with long, dark hair hanging loose, a pale face, and deep, hollow eyes staring at her through the mirror. Clara screamed in terror, spinning around, but there was nothing. Only the old mirror, reflecting her own pale, terrified face. She rushed out of the bathroom, trembling uncontrollably, her heart racing. She tried to calm herself down, telling herself it was just an illusion, due to her exhaustion and stress. But the fear had already taken root in her mind. She began to avoid looking in mirrors, avoiding the dark corners of the house, and trying not to be alone for too long. She turned on all the lights in the house, but the light seemed unable to dispel the invisible darkness that enveloped the house. The fear prompted Clara to investigate the house's history. She went to the local library in Salem, searching for old documents, articles related to her house's address. She flipped through old books, old newspapers, the smell of decaying paper wafting up her nose, making her feel as if she was traveling back in time. Finally, she found an old article about a mysterious disappearance that occurred in the 1970s at the very house she was living in. A woman named Eleanor Vance had vanished without a trace after being accused of practicing dark magic, and neighbors said they often heard screams, strange noises coming from the house. Police investigated, but found no clues, and the case gradually faded into obscurity. Clara read the article over and over again, every word seeming to cut into her mind. Eleanor Vance, the woman from her dreams. Could she be the spirit haunting this house, haunting her? One stormy night, as Clara lay curled up in bed, trying to fall asleep, she suddenly heard screams echoing from downstairs. Agonizing, horrifying screams, like a woman being tortured. Clara's hair stood on end, cold sweat trickling down her back. She knew it wasn't the wind, or the sounds of old pipes. It was the cry for help, the lament of Eleanor Vance. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to ward off the terrifying sound, but it echoed relentlessly in her head, repeating over and over, becoming clearer and clearer. Suddenly, she felt a cold hand touch her neck, a chilling breath on her ear, and a terrifying whisper. "You will be me, you will never escape." Clara opened her eyes. She clearly saw a faint shadow of Eleanor Vance standing right next to her bed, her lifeless eyes staring straight at her, a grotesque, distorted smile. She tried to scream, but no sound came out, as if an invisible hand was squeezing her throat. She felt a chilling current pass through her body, as if something was trying to possess her, to enter her. Clara woke up, drenched in sweat, breathing heavily, but her eyes were still filled with panic. She didn't know if it was a dream or reality, but the obsession with Eleanor Vance had deeply embedded itself in her mind, unable to be erased. She couldn't stay in that house for another second. She quickly packed her belongings, leaving behind everything she couldn't carry, rushing out of the house without a single glance back. Clara left Salem. She moved to another city, trying to start a new life. But no matter where she was, the fear still clung to her. She couldn't sleep soundly. The dreams of Eleanor Vance still haunted her every night, the pale face, the black, hollow eyes, and the grotesque smile kept appearing in her mind. She knew that, no matter where she went, Eleanor Vance would always be there, an eternal ghost, waiting for the next victim, and perhaps, she would forever be a part of that terrifying story. The story of the haunted house in Salem remains an unsolved mystery, a curse that continues.